Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to the release of our new policy paper, The Backbone of JADC2, Satellite Communications for Information Age Warfare. It was written by General Kevin Chilton, our Explorer Chair for Space Warfighting Studies at the Mitchell Institute Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence, or MI Space, and Lukas Autenried, a senior analyst here at MI Space, who are both with us today. And we're also very fortunate to be joined on our panel by Dr. David Voss and Stephen Forbes. Dr. Voss is the director of Spectrum Warfare Center at the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, or SWAC, where he leads the team responsible for the analytic foundations of the Space Force's force design efforts. Mr. Forbes is the DARPA program manager for Blackjack, a joint DARPA Space Systems Command AFRL program that's helping to demonstrate the military utility of next generation space constellations. So welcome, gentlemen, and thanks very much for joining us today. To kick things off, let me offer a couple of words of background. This report comes as the Department of Defense is developing new concepts to maintain our competitive advantage against China and Russia. These concepts share a common theme, that being the importance of speed and integration of information. So we've got to be able to rapidly and seamlessly collect, process, and share information to achieve accurate situational awareness, to improve the speed and quality of command decisions, and then to integrate operations to meet our mission requirements. In essence, that's what JADC2 is all about. However, specific requirements needed to operationalize JADC2 are still being defined. Now, our latest policy paper is intended to help shed some light on one of the key components of JADC2, that being space-based communications. As the report's title suggests, it highlights how maturing technologies such as laser communications and new space architecture designs will ensure DOD's SATCOM enterprise serves as the backbone for JADC2 initiatives to enable decisive all-domain operations. So with that little bit of a background, what I'm going to do now is turn this over to the author of the report to provide a summary of the paper, followed by some brief remarks from our guest speakers, and then we'll jump into Q&A. So over to you, General Chilton and Lukas, for the presentation.
Thanks, General Deptula, and thanks for all the folks the participants who have joined us today. We've got a good turnout and really appreciate the support. And before we begin, I think it's important to say that by protocol, they put my name first on the report, but the gentleman, my teammate here, Lukas, has really made strong contributions to this effort. And indeed, the yeoman's work was done by Lukas. And I also want to give a shout out to General Larry Stutz, who also had his fingerprints on this report, which I think is an excellent piece of work. And now Lukas and I would like to give you a brief summary of the Mitchell Space's latest report. We'll start with a few charts here. And it's a report on why we believe a combination of LEO, MEO, and GEO constellations of satellites linked together by optical communications can and should be the linchpin of DOD's Joint All-Domain Command and Control Architecture, or JADC2. Next chart, please. I think a logical question is, why now? Why did we put this report out at this time? Well, we're releasing it at a time when DOD is thinking through how it intends to deter and defeat great power aggression. The transition to planning for great power competition and conflict poses multiple challenges for DOD's SATCOM enterprise. For the sake of brevity, I'll just mention three of them. First, we know that DOD's emerging all-domain warfighting concepts are creating new and more demanding requirements for its SATCOM enterprise. Second, DOD is working hard to define these and other requirements for its JADC2 architecture, and our report is intended to help inform some of those requirements. And thirdly, our warfighters are accustomed to operating in a world where adversaries could not target our SATCOM capabilities. This is certainly not the case today. Space is not a sanctuary, and our SATCOM systems must be more resilient and agile if they are to provide the secure, on-demand connectivity required by our warfighters. The good news is there are promising technologies such as laser communications and new force designs that will help address these and other new requirements. The bottom line is these technologies, combined with the consolidation of responsibility for the SATCOM enterprise in the U.S. Space Force, has created a unique opportunity to build the systems our warfighters will need in the coming decades. Next chart, please. This quick overview of our current MIL-SATCOM enterprise will help give you a baseline understanding of why change is needed. Most MIL-SATCOM satellites are now in geosynchronous orbits where they maintain a fixed position relative to the ground. This is advantageous in this it allows them to provide continuous coverage of up to 42% of the Earth, including coverage over areas where our forces might need to operate that lack other communication networks. However, it is also true that our SATCOM systems have become larger, more complex, and more expensive over time. And this is because DoD prioritized improving their performance, longevity, and efficiency, which also increased their costs and reduced the number of satellites that DoD could afford to buy. And given the historic high cost to launch satellites into orbit, it made good sense to pack as much capability as possible into a single satellite. So while our SATCOM architecture is extremely efficient, it is also brittle, especially in a space environment that is now contested. Another aspect worth pointing out is that numerous services and other organizations have been responsible for SATCOM acquisition and operation. These organizations tended to focus on their mission requirements, which contributed to the development of a fragmented SATCOM enterprise. And vendor proprietary equities, as well as overclassification issues, also contributed to the problem. The result is our SATCOM systems are very well vertically integrated, but have very little flexibility. Next chart, please. At this point, I'd like to turn the briefing over to Lukas, who will expand on these points.
All right, thank you, sir. So General Deptula highlighted at the front sort of the basic premise of JADC2, but I'd just like to add here that space-based communications are going to be absolutely essential to DoD's plans for JADC2. And as just one example, a core tenet of the concept is the ability to connect any sensor to the best available shooter in path-agnostic ways. And although there are a multitude of ways to pass data, the increased ranges and distributed way in which U.S. forces intend to operate in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere inevitably makes passing high volumes of information through space necessary. And as General Chilton said, DoD's current SATCOM systems and architectures are not sufficient to support its new all-domain warfighting concepts. And so I'll just mention 3 deficiencies in particular that we address in our report. So the first is there's insufficient bandwidth to accommodate the larger amounts of data being generated by ISR systems. And at the same time, next generation systems are increasingly reliant on external sources of information to function, and more data intensive forms of information at that. So you really have both a supply and demand problem in terms of moving information from where it is to where it needs to get to. And this shortcoming was highlighted during the most recent Project Convergence exercise. The second is the high latency associated with sending a signal 32,000 kilometers up to satellites in geo, which is prohibitive for an increasing number of military tasks, such as some forms of time-sensitive targeting, and also for capabilities such as augmented reality displays or remotely piloted systems where you need information that reflects the real-time reality. And third is the lack of interoperability of current systems that we touched on earlier. This is definitely a DoD-wide problem for sure, but I think it's particularly acute for SATCOM. And this is a big problem because network interoperability is going to be absolutely critical to enabling disparate joint systems to interact effectively, and that's just simply not the case today. Next slide, please. So General Chilton also mentioned the growing threat posed by adversary counter space capabilities. And I think it's useful to sort of take a quick step back to sort of think about how both China and Russia approach warfare in the information age. I think both militaries have adopted an information-centric warfighting strategy that prioritizes achieving information superiority as their main line of effort in conflict. So, much in the same way that we talk about air superiority as a precondition to success, in their way of thinking, information superiority is a precondition to a successful military operation. And they also know that space capabilities are a major source and conduit of information for the US military. And so they view these assets as high priority targets. And this is why, in their way of thinking, future conflicts are likely to start in the space and cyber domains. And if they don't start there, they're going to rapidly extend into those domains. And so China and Russia have both developed their military doctrine, organizations, and capabilities to contest or deny US space operations. So for the PLA, its Strategic Support Force is sort of the focal point for its information operations, including space, and integrating that into their joint operations. And for Russia, most of its military space operations have been consolidated within its reorganized aerospace forces. And so both recognize that use of the space domain has provided the US with enormous warfighting advantages over the past 30 years. But at the same time, they view DoD's dependence on its brittle space architecture as an exploitable vulnerability. And so both have capabilities to target every aspect of the US space architecture. So that includes, the satellites on orbit, the comms links that connect the various nodes together, the ground infrastructure that supports them, but also the data that these things generate and transport. Next slide, please. So what can DoD do to address these challenges? Well, as General Chilton mentioned, what's needed is a hybrid architecture that leverages SATCOM networks across multiple orbital regimes and that ties these various satellite nodes, both within and across different networks together using laser communications. And I think this is a key point. Proliferated small sats, particularly in low Earth orbit, are absolutely critical part of the solution. But these are meant to complement, not replace existing assets in GEO. I think both are needed and provide, important and complementary capabilities. But here I'm just going to mention 4 key things that we think proliferated LEO small sats can sort of bring to the table. And so starting with reduced latency, right? It takes a lot less time to send a signal a few hundred kilometers up to LEO than 32,000 kilometers to GEO. In fact, because light travels through the vacuum of space faster than the glass inside of fiber optic cables, over longer distances, you can actually get lower latency through space than the fastest available terrestrial networks. You also get better overall coverage. Because LEO small sats are constantly in motion relative to the Earth, you end up getting coverage in areas like the Arctic that otherwise wouldn't be prioritized, particularly by commercial companies. And because their look angles are constantly changing relative to the user on the ground, across a large constellation, you have a better chance of having at least one satellite in your line of sight at all times, especially in areas that have terrain features that can obscure your view of overhead assets in GEO. You also get greater overall network capacity. So while it's true that an individual small sat in LEO will not have the same bandwidth capacity as a typical GEO SATCOM, particularly newer high throughput satellites, the overall network capacity of a proliferated constellation is going to be typically a much greater, just because of the much larger number of satellites that are in that constellation. And these numbers are also the basis for getting significantly improved resilience. So the greater numbers means that there's a lot more targets that the adversary has to worry about. It has to be able to track them, needs to be able to prioritize which ones to target, and then actually attack them. And also the network is also going to degrade much more gracefully. So as whereas the loss of a few monolithic satellites in GEO would result in the catastrophic failure of the system, a proliferated LEO constellation could withstand the loss of more nodes before losing significant capability. And I think it's also worth noting that it's a lot faster and cheaper to reconstitute small sats in LEO, whether that's using on-orbit spares or satellites that are stored in the ground. You really can't do that with GEO satellites in impractical timelines. Next slide, please. But these proliferated constellations alone are not the answer. DoD also needs optical communications that will help it get the most out of its proliferated layered architectures. So just at a technical level, laser comms give you a huge boost in performance that can't be achieved by radio frequency communications that are used today. And that starts with just an order of magnitude improvement in data rates. And that's just sort of a baseline benchmark that these laser comm companies are targeting. Sort of the upper bound on what the improvement in throughput will be could actually be much more than that. These are also much more efficient just because they can be put into a smaller form factor and they consume less power. This is because it's a really highly concentrated signal. So really what you're getting is the most data per watt. And these sort of size and power consumption considerations are particularly important when you're talking about space, where both those things are going to be an absolute premium, particularly as you sort of move towards these smaller form factor satellite buses. And then the third factor I'd want to highlight is just the low probability of detection, low probability of intercept capability of these things. So, right, it's a highly directional beam that has very minimal spillage. So it's actually really hard to detect these transmissions. And even if you're able to detect them, they're very difficult to disrupt. And doing so is going to put you in a position where you're highly susceptible to counter detection and then potential countermeasures by the good guys. So given these capabilities, what are the most promising uses for laser comms? We think a good initial application should be to use them as crosslinks for satellites that are either on the same or adjacent orbital planes, across orbital regimes, and eventually out to cislunar space as well. But just to focus quickly on the LEO portion of this, these optical crosslinks are how DoD can overcome the limited coverage footprints of individual LEO satellites and their constant motion relative to the Earth. Right, so absent these crosslinks that allow satellites to communicate directly with one another, the ground infrastructure that you need to support these constellations would be enormous. And it also adds a significant amount of complexity and time in terms of trying to get information from where it is to where it needs to be. So you need this ability to move information through the space layer, and that's done through these crosslinks. And so, taking these crosslinks, if you have multiple terminals on a given satellite, on any given satellite, and you combine this with an autonomous mission management system, that's the basis for forming a self-healing mesh network in space that can relay data through the fastest possible route that's available. And it can also adaptively route around threatened or disabled satellites. So, as an adversary is attempting to disrupt your communications, you can find an available pathway in order to get your information through to who needs it. And you can also use these optical terminals to potentially connect disparate constellations together, right? It's not just within a given network. And you can either do this using common standards for the terminals. So think of what SDA is doing with its published open standard. And so, for example, it recently contracted a commercial company to plug its synthetic aperture radar satellites directly into the transport layer using these compatible terminals. Or potentially, you can also use gateways with reconfigurable terminals like what DARPA is currently pursuing through its Space Bacon program, right? So that these otherwise incompatible networks might be able to connect with each other to distribute information through, a much denser, much higher capacity overall architecture. And then just to this, the last main bullet here, it's not just about the ability to rapidly and securely transport data through space, right? We also want to be able to bring actionable information down to the terrestrial warfighter. And there are some additional challenges that come with propagating a laser through the atmosphere, but these effects are relatively well understood, and there are both technical and operational planning workarounds that can help mitigate the impacts of these on performance. But still, given these considerations, we think a good initial candidate for integrating optical terminals would be on high altitude airborne systems. And this is both because they can operate above most of the weather phenomena that can impact laser performance. But these are also exactly the types of platforms that could benefit from the improved performance that laser communications provide. And that's both in terms of leveraging the improved throughput, so you can fully exploit the enormous amount of information that the multiple sensor packages that these platforms collect, but also exploiting that sort of low probability of intercept, low probability of detection, anti-jam capability that lasers provide. Right, the ability to push these platforms into contested areas, where they'll be able to rapidly send and receive information, whereas traditional RF SATCOM might be more vulnerable to detection and disruption. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, as we've talked through here, the U.S. Space Force should proliferate, distribute, disaggregate, and diversify its SATCOM options across multiple orbital regimes, and we think especially in low Earth orbit. And then it should connect these various nodes and networks together using optical intersatellite links to exploit the full potential of what these satellites can potentially provide. And then DoD should also conduct rapid experimentation and demonstrate optical terminals on airborne and terrestrial systems, but focusing on where it makes technical and operational sense. And then I just want to focus a bit on these last 2 points on the slide. So, starting with the fourth bullet, DoD has long relied on commercial SATCOM services, and there are limits to what DoD can do on its own in-house. So I think taking advantage of growing investment and more frequent satellite construction and launches, the Space Force should really explore options to expand its partnerships with allied nations and commercial providers to host government payloads on their satellite buses, and then also explore new ways to acquire commercial SATCOM services. And there's a lot of really exciting work going on in this realm. And then lastly, transitioning to the kind of architecture that we've described requires a terrestrial infrastructure capable of supporting it. And really, this is about being able to handle the greater complexity and speed of these lower orbit constellations, but then also about promoting greater interoperability, right? Some of this can be done, through the space layer, but a lot of that is going to also have to come through the terrestrial infrastructure. And our report goes into a lot more detail about those things, and also happy to discuss that further. But I'll stop here and turn it back over to General Chilton for a couple more conclusions and closing remarks. General?
Thanks, Lucas. Thank you. This is hard work, putting this all together and describing and writing up the requirements to actually field a system like this. And that hard work is work that needs to be done by the U.S. Space Force, and specifically by their Space Warfighting and Analysis Center, who's chartered to lay out these architectures and do the trades for the trade space assessments for what to invest in and what to divest, and determine the critical path that will lead to the future SATCOM enterprise, much as we've just described. And then lastly, the U.S. Space Force must work closely, we believe, with the industrial base, with our industrial partners, to accelerate the fielding of these capabilities. Transitioning to a layered architecture that includes proliferated constellations will require industry to manufacture satellites at an unprecedented rate. And to make this happen, the Space Force, and not just the Space Force, the entire Department of Defense acquisition system must remove barriers to manufacturing new systems at scale, particularly if it wants to take advantage of the growing ecosystem of space companies beyond the traditional space primes, who will also be important in the solution to this issue. I'd like to close by saying we don't really have time to waste in our view in fielding this type of capabilities. These are critical capabilities that JADC2 will depend on to achieve the vision that our warfighters have for a future joint command and control system. We've heard a lot about the need for hypersonic weapons, but laser comms and other technologies that we've discussed in this briefing and in the report are just as game-changing to enabling the command and control that will be required to give the U.S. forces the advantages they'll need in any future conflict. As Lukas said, these technologies aren't science fiction. They are mature and ready to transition to our warfighters. Frankly, now it's more a matter of finalizing the future force structure design and funding to make it happen. The technology barriers are not as steep as those first two. And David, with that, General Deptula, we'll turn it back over to you.
Very good. Thanks, gentlemen, for that overview. What I'd like to do now is give our panelists an opportunity to provide a few opening remarks on the presentation and on the subject in general. So let's start with Dr. Voss, and then Stephen, you can finish up as the cleanup batter. So over to you, David.
Thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel, and just really want to congratulate you on the timeliness of the report as you guys have written. I absolutely concur with the criticality of the JADC2 vision and the ability to implement the interoperability and interconnectivity needs that you guys have identified both in your opening remarks and throughout the report. So just a fantastic job on the report. Thank you for that work. And I strongly recommend it to the folks on the net as an excellent primer to understand some of the opportunity space and the complexity of how to approach this hybrid space architecture in the term of SATCOM, both as we look to the terrestrial transport needs, as well as the celestial transport needs going forward. Both have to be thought in concurrence as we look to connect this interconnected and interoperable architecture of the JADC2 vision going forward. the challenge of knowing what is the topology that we need to be able to acquire is, I think, what a lot of the where we're at today. And so depending upon what is your scope of who your user is, how your user needs to behave, and the numbers of users, it really drives you to radically different potential transport architectures. And so when you read the report, as you begin to think through the scope of potentially the information synchronization that was identified between disparate C2 nodes within an AOR, as well as the need to synchronize those C2 nodes with a CONUS kind of concept of operation as well. And then as you begin to look at the variability of high priority users that have a very high mission assurance to the potentially the hundreds of thousands to millions of users that could take advantage of this within a coalition architecture, it really drives you to a complex understanding of what topology is the appropriate topology that we need to acquire, not only as a Space Force, but in partnership with our other US government agencies, as well as our allies in the commercial market. And so I think the report just does a great job highlighting the opportunity space that sits in front of us going forward. I think in order to help capture, I think, how we're thinking analytically about this hybrid space architecture for SATCOM, we very notionally have bended into several categories. When we describe what we've been referred to as a foundational layer, this foundational layer it's critical it embraces the multi-orbit aspects that are highlighted here, that takes advantage of the global perspective that GEO brings, as well as the proliferated nature that LEO brings. This foundational layer is the natural inclusion of commercial capabilities within a diversified architecture. It gives us that path agnostic capability that was identified, not only within a contested environment, just through the nature of the complexity of delivering these communication systems for either 5G or even future 6G applications. Having redundant paths to different service providers is critical, not only for DoD applications, but also the resilience that we have all come to expect as an information world going forward. That's also a very natural location to ingest and bring in our allies, which are a critical part of our coalition strategy and how we want to move forward. It is also the ability for us to regularly practice and implement this idea of path agnostic comms and this low latency need for this synchronization that has to happen. It's an incredibly complex process that requires both an understanding of the physical layer and the networking layer and the application layer that has to be brought together, and how we practice and fight in that particular way. Then there are other layers that are more of the protected layers that really buy down on some potential vulnerabilities of this foundational layer. As was identified within the report, we live in a contested space domain now, where if all of our if our only strategy for communication is through a homogeneous path, it is too easy to interrupt that path if there's just one path. And so we need the ability to still have a subset of a protected layer. However, if that protected layer has to meet the totality of the requirements across all of the service components, across all of the globe, and be protected through the entire, that's a very cost prohibitive strategy. And so as we look at this layered strategy, it's critical that we both understand the phenomenologies, the networking strategies, and the acquisition processes for being able to move both within this diversified hybrid foundational layer and protected layer going forward. And once again, I think the report did an excellent job identifying some of those challenges. I think some of the technologies that were highlighted are critical for us to rapidly move out on. Laser communications is a fantastic area that was highlighted that we need to continue to move forward on. Interoperability between disparate constellations, both within a particular orbital regime like LEO or MEO or GEO, as well as interorbital regimes going forward. I think I just want to maintain the emphasis on the need to have both hybridity, not only within orbit regimes, but also within the phenomenologies of optical and RF. As we think of the diverse numbers of users, LaserCom is fantastic when you look at the movement of data within constellations, or particularly a fewer higher value users. But as we look at the thousands to millions, hundreds of thousands to millions of users, it's very hard for the proliferation of laser. So RF is still a critical part of that hybrid architecture going forward. And so trying to understand the implication of when is it RF versus optical, how do we have those standards to be able to work within those different phenomenologies to be as interconnected as possible. And when do we choose not to be interconnected at the physical layer, but we back that out into the networking or the application layers, both within the cloud or within some of the various application layers of the different programs. Hybrid adaptive terminals, I think, is critical. Understanding or having terminals that are able to be multi-service as well as multi-orbit is really an enabler for embracing these capabilities coming online, and provides the user the ability to not have to bring many pieces of hardware into the field. And so having hybrid adaptive terminals is critical to enable this vision, as well as the ability to have automated service infrastructure that allows us to roam across various service providers based off a quality of service framework. That's also a very, once again, as highlighted in the paper, that's a challenge in how we have traditionally acquired SATCOM services. It's also a challenge in how we currently do a lot of our provisioning of the network that sits behind that. And so having the ability to both have the philosophical underpinning of what is the right recipe for that, and then the strategy validation experiments to be able to demonstrate that networking topology, as well as the costing and the procurement framework to be able to acquire that, are critical things that we need to understand and wrap our heads around as fast as possible to enable this JADC2 vision that's going forward. And then I think there's also a really important role that we need to understand of the level of C2 edge versus centralized orchestration that needs to happen. Really, in this foundational layer, the use cases are so large that it really would lean towards very diversified orchestration between commercial and allies, similar to how the internet is managed today. And so understanding how do we do those edge synchronization events with the centrally orchestrated within the DOD framework is something we have to understand as well. But I think there's much more I could say, but once again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and just a fantastic job on the report that you guys released. Over.
Okay, over to you, Stephen.
No, thank you. I want to echo, Dr. Voss. This was a very timely report, and also echo everything that David said. In this case, I'm really glad that I sit on the S&T side of things. Developing technologies, reducing the cost of laser comm terminals, bringing more processing capability to space, and am not responsible for figuring out, how operationally, it gets built out into an operational system. The SWAC has a far harder job than I do in this case. But I fundamentally believe that the bandwidth and the power that laser comm offers is a key enabler for any of the high data rate communications, whether that's terrestrial or space. I think it's well suited for both of those. And so for Blackjack, we want to try and demonstrate a proliferated mesh communications architecture, that is sort of foundational to proliferated LEO, and quite honestly, to a lot of, to any sort of proliferated space constellation. It doesn't really matter whether it's LEO, MEO, GEO, CIS, lunar. As soon as you start moving out of single digit, spacecraft, the ability to stitch them all together in a resilient communication mesh is going to be a critical enabler to overcome those the threats and the challenges that we face, and build a much less brittle architecture. And optical is a great way of doing that. It's not well suited for serving mass users. It is not well served for folks that have, weather or extremely limited swap, constraints. And that's why I also believe that, especially when you get out of the backhaul sort of class of, or backbone class of the portion of the network, that RF will always have its place to serve the users. Never underestimate the ability of doing like a UHF, 10 kilobit communication channel that essentially can fit in, the person's palm of their hand and works essentially in all weather and all environments. So there will always be roles for both domains. The other thing that we're tackling, in addition to the communications, the laser comm, is trying to bring some of that processing to space. LEO is a very benign orbital environment that allows us to bring a lot of modern processing up to the edge. And that helps us, from my view of the architecture, it gives the option of not having to move all of the data, from sensor in terms of like raw focal plane data to every user. It allows you to essentially decimate that data, get the key, information attributes out of that data stream, and just disseminate those. And that's one of the places where I think LEO does have a significant advantage over some of the other orbital regimes, is because we can bring so much more processing and so much more of the modern processing architectures to bear there. Just the radiation environment at LEO and other domains makes that very, very challenging. So, but again, I'm fortunate that I sit at DARPA and get to push the technology and try and give as many different Lego building blocks to David and to this acquisition community who will actually have to acquire operational systems. So with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And what I'd like to do now is dig into some of the points that you all have raised in greater detail. So I'll direct my questions to each of you, but any one of you feel free to jump in as you'd like. So first one for you, Stephen. When it comes to satellites, historically lower cost tended to mean lower performance. As we're talking about deploying large numbers of cheaper, smaller satellites in LEO, does that paradigm still hold true, particularly given recent advancements in areas such as microelectronics and commercial space?
Yeah, I would say that the shift from GEO to LEO, knocking off 30-some thousand kilometers of path length and the associated losses really actually helps you, actually provide more capability potentially, in terms of just absolute sensitivity at LEO than you would at GEO. At the end of the day, we're looking for a set number of photons in whatever spectrum that they're out there. And the ability to shrink the aperture because of, either the R squared, R cubed, or R to the fourth losses, of LEO compared to GEO really makes those low cost, payloads viable. When we started Blackjack, we weren't sure whether that was going to hold true. We were wondering whether we get 1 or 2 missions, 1 or 2 vendors that came in and said, we can build a militarily relevant payload for, a recurring cost of $1.5 million or less. We essentially got payload offerings across the full spectrum of space remote sensing and communications and PNT that were all viable. And we, ultimately ended up, I believe, awarding about 13 payload contracts across 8 or so different mission areas. Now obviously most of those were simply initial, take a design to PDR, preliminary design review, and flesh out the concept. So I think in this case that the reduced signal path length really allows LEO to play at a very price competitive point. And that is wrapped into that ability to play is the microelectronics revolution, the cell phones, just the shrinking of computers, has really changed that paradigm and allowed us to put a lot of capability into a LEO spacecraft without having to, because of the radiation environment, go up to an exquisite, expensive class of lower performing microelectronics.
Oh, thank you for that. Dr. Voss, with all the excitement surrounding proliferated LEO, I think there's a danger in viewing it as a panacea and to forget about the potential of leveraging other orbits for SATCOM as well. Could you provide some insight into how the SWAC is thinking about leveraging SATCOM in multiple orbits as a part of a future hybrid space architecture?
I appreciate it. So I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting. I grew up in the new space community. So LEO to me was where we flew the majority of our small sats as we were launching them. And I have come to really grow to appreciate and understand a lot of the value that GEO brings to the community. When you look at an information architecture as a whole, each of the orbits bring a value function that is nice to have at an enterprise level. And so, the ability to see the entire globe from geo, as your paper highlighted, really was why we went there from the first point. It gives you an efficiency both within the networking architecture, and it gives you the ability to see a very large geographic area, but it brings apart some of those vulnerabilities that you talked about, where a single lost asset could also result in a very large gap getting created. LEO helps address a number of those concerns. As addition to what Stephen was saying, the R-squared is very attractive when it comes to the physics of latency and whatnot going forward. The resiliency of the multi-orbit architecture is definitely an attractive component to it, as well as you look at both the orbit diversity and the distributed nature of that architecture. The actual path loss latency is critical, but when you look at some of our aggregate latencies, if you think of the summation of all the things that make up latency within a kill chain or kill web, oftentimes the provisioning of the comm massively dwarfs the networking synchronization part massively dwarfs the path loss within that as well. And so from a force designing standpoint, not only do we need to make sure that we take advantage of the LEO-based latency, but the networking that sits behind that and the understanding of who needs to talk to who, both within a kind of an AOR, but also back to the synchronization in CONUS, really drives you to, we have to understand the networking latencies as well, which LEO is really challenged with. And those are some of the things that Stephen is really trying to wrap his head around in terms of the networking complexity that LEO brings to bear. Many of these cross-link options are fantastic, but they come with the whole networking complexity that sits behind it, especially when you start talking networking across different vendors going forward. And so we see a very strong role for the various orbit regimes to come in both from a performance and capability standpoint, a resiliency standpoint, and a cost standpoint in an integrated architecture. I think that the challenge we're at right now as we're doing some of these big data analytics is, what is the recipe and how much of each do you need against that JADC2 problem as you look at provisioning the various types of users across the different services. And so you have very natural users who will benefit very much from what Stephen is demonstrating or SDA is demonstrating. And you have other users who will benefit very naturally from a geo-based deployment. What we want to make sure is that users have the ability within these hybrid terminals that if their preferred path is no longer available due to either normal complexities or adversarial intent, they have the ability to fall back to these other capabilities, even if it's not optimum. It gives us within a primary, alternate, contingent, emergency kind of a pace structure, this graceful degradation across these kind of hybrid space architectures. And so I think we see a very strong role for the various orbit regimes. The question right now is what is that recipe for them versus kind of that foundational layer and then this kind of protected layer going forward.
Thank you. General Chilton, you and Lukas touched on it a bit during the briefing, but I'd like to reattack the subject of the threat environment. In recent years, people have often assumed that in a conflict with either China or Russia, RF SATCOM would be unavailable or highly degraded for aircraft and other platforms operating in contested areas. How could that impact U.S. operations? And on the other side of the coin, how does having assured connectivity through laser comms change things?
Well, Lukas, I'll jump on that first, and please, add what your views. As General Hyten has talked about, the large, I think he said big, fat, juicy targets, which is our geosynchronous satellites. We don't have a lot of them. They're incredibly capable, but they're incredibly vulnerable. And I find it hard to believe, given that they've demonstrated the capabilities to reach those orbital altitudes with anti-satellite weapons, that our adversaries would not be planning on doing such to put themselves in an advantage in the area of operations where we're going to be fighting. And so that is the problem that we have to address. Now, you can make them more maneuverable, but they are what they are right now, and they're not very maneuverable. And so you can spend your dollars on making a highly maneuverable satellite up there. You can build an architecture that is more difficult for an adversary to take down. And that's what this combination of LEO, MEO, and GEO interlinked with optical communications would provide, would be a difficult, much more difficult architecture for an adversary to take down. Certainly not one they could take down on the first day of the war, which they could with our geostationary satellite systems. But one, if they attacked, would maintain a level of resilience long enough for us to counterattack. And that's important as we think about that. So, I mean, those are my thoughts on why we need to move in this direction, the advantages of it, besides everything that David and Stephen have talked about already, of the various modalities we can provide with this architecture to the various users. Lucas, anything you'd like to add?
Just to, just a little more on what you said, I think, what we're really talking about here is maintaining sufficient levels of connectivity to get the job done. But, we're not just trying to sit back, and see how many punches our satellite constellations can take. This is about opening up options so that we can also go and get done what we need to get done. So I think it's not just all about the defensive. And I think, sir, is something that you've highlighted before, right? We need to pair this with our own capabilities to go on the offensive as well.
Yeah, I'd foot stomp that. I'd spend my first dollar, frankly, on offensive capability. Because right now they have it and we don't, which means they can deny us our space capabilities and retain their own. And that's totally an unsatisfactory environment to send our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and guardians into, in my view. But this is also a critical element, and that is building a future architecture that also contributes to deterrence by planting the seed in an adversary's mind that they won't be able to successfully eliminate this critical capability that our whole command and control environment is going to depend on in the future.
Well, thank you both for that. And while there's a heck of a lot more to discuss, what I want to do is open this session up to Q&A from the audience. So just as a reminder, all of you can participate by either sending in on the Q&A a chat or use the raise hand function. Please do state your name and affiliation when you ask a question. So with that, let's go first to Teresa Hitchens.
Hi, this is Teresa Hitchens from Breaking Defense, and thanks to you all for doing this. It was really interesting. My question is for Dr. Voss. I'm wondering if you can talk about the SWAC's work on creating a force design for a hybrid architecture for SATCOM, and when you think you might come up with a product, like where you're at in that process. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question. Not fast enough from what we've been told. As you can imagine, there's a lot of complexity in an architecture such as this. There's a lot of what I like to refer to as competing value function analysis. There are many great ways to tackle this problem, and depending on your scope of the user, it naturally would lend to a very logical topology for that particular scope of user. So what we're in the process right now of doing is really trying to understand the complexity of the diverse user base across the various services and how they could leverage a space-based integration capability, and then understand what is the orbital deployment strategy based off of the diversity of the user types and how they want to use it. And then also trying to analytically anchor what within a acquisition model, there is kind of one end of the trade space is what happens if the DOD really procured the majority of this hybrid architecture approach, or what if we had a very robust commercial multi-orbit space capability that we embraced and we had more of the DOD focus on the protected layer. Though that's a very large dynamic range from both a capability and a deployment strategy that we're trying to wrap our head around and tease out the topological implications of that world. And so, it will be a work in progress for a while. However, as was highlighted at the beginning of this event, we can't wait years to do analytics and make decisions. And so we are implementing at the SWAC a continuous integration model of analytic processes that allow us to be able to understand the macro implications of this topology as fast as possible to help inform the current POM and plan efforts, and start aligning as fast as possible either our current investments that might require pivots, or where do we need to put those first dollars to get the max benefit out of this architecture. So it will be a continuous kind of integration process that's co-aligned with the POM and the plan. And hopefully, think of it like a funnel. We're going to continue to integrate more and more with our acquisition partners, SSC, and the SQ staff, as well as some of the other space-based acquisition partners like SDA and others. So.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? You mentioned right up front. So part of this analysis is actually starting from what capabilities do the users have to integrate into the orbital architecture, which seems to me to be something that wasn't done before. Generally, it was the other way around, in that the services are the ones that have to pay for their own terminals and things like that. So I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. Thank you.
So we're evaluating the implication of the orbital deployments against a variety of user terminal implications is maybe the way to phrase that. So you could envision a handful of implications for users. So we're trying to wrap our heads around what happens if we had user equipment that had the minimal amount of change. You weren't allowed to touch the hardware. What could we do in space to help enable JADC2 concepts for those users where they can't really upgrade or change their terminals? That's kind of the first category. The second category is what if we were able to upgrade terminal hardware, potentially firmware, or maybe some of the front end analog circuitry, but you're still fundamentally constrained by the swap that the users have. That would be kind of a second category of user implications. And then the third category is what happens if we kind of had a clean slate and we were able to embrace this hybrid terminal construct that is able to roam across LEO, MEO, or GEO, and different service providers, which is definitely it would be a new terminal procurement with a very large cost implication for our partners within the different services. And so from a Space Force standpoint, we really want to be very cognizant and aware of the implication of the orbital deployment strategy to the user hardware going forward. And so we have a couple categories as we look at that orbital deployment strategy. Over.
Thank you. That helped a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, let's turn to David Shaw.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, great program. Thanks. Could you all speak to the securing the transmission? I put that in the Q&A, so you can disregard the question there. But regardless of orbit, it seems to me that there's a massive threat on the cyber side of state, non-state actors doing non-attributable mischief in the securing of the transmissions. And again, I probably haven't had a chance to read the report because I just downloaded it about 5 minutes ago, so it may be addressed in there. I don't know, but thank you.
Well, I don't think we go into great detail on that threat, but it's certainly one we recognize. And so, I mean, David, your point's exactly right. The entire space enterprise, whether it's SATCOM, ISR, GPS, whatever, we have to worry about the cybersecurity, both of the ground architecture that supports the satellite systems, the TT&C, the command channels that go up and back to those satellite systems. All of those are areas that need to be protected, and they're vulnerable not only to cyber, but also to kinetic strikes. And so we need to consider all of those things as we go forward, regardless of the architecture.
Maybe I could just jump in too. I think this is a really exciting opportunity for the community to embrace some of the lessons we've learned from the terrestrial deployment of the internet as we begin to deploy this space internet kind of construct, where we can build in at both the physical layer and the networking layer some of the security measures, things like ledger-based authentication capabilities, transec and multi-point encryption. There's a lot of technical complexity to that we have the opportunity to start off the right way as we're really at this pivotal point going forward. So definitely not a simple answer or a single technology to fix the whole problem, but just a real opportunity, particularly for our industrial community, to start off with a lot of the right foundation as we begin to deploy this kind of architecture. Over.
And lastly, David, thanks for mentioning. I think using the optical links will provide us an additional options for being more flexible in our encryption and how we exchange data on orbit more securely.
Okay, Norm, I'll give you another chance. Were you able to fix your problem there?
I have, and my question is for Dr. Voss there. I realize a lot of our discussion has been somewhat long-term, but what are we doing? Or is there low-hanging fruit that we can bring into the AOC so that we can better fight tonight and get after the type of things that our chief's looking for in the way of accelerate our decision-making, better comms, a more robust pace plan, so to speak, as we go more into distributed operations? Over.
Great question. I think, I think there's a certain amount of cultural impediment to the way that this architecture is brought to bear than how we've traditionally fought with SATCOM that we need to address. Oftentimes you still think of having human orchestrated scheduling. We have human in the loop driving a significant portion of this. Of our current SATCOM architecture or our AFRL or our scheduling of our satellite operations. It is a very challenging model for scaling to the levels that we're talking about within the JADC2 and the timelines that are associated for that. So I think as we begin to embrace these hybrid terminals and the networking that sits behind that, I think as fast as possible, we need to start understanding not only the technical implications of this type of it, but start to understand what are the operational impacts? How do we do our plans around this? And that's something that we need to begin to practice and operate off of now. When you begin to look at some of the AFRL exercises with partnering with Starlink, or there's significant capability out there right now, and I think we need to begin to understand the human element in addition to the complexity of the networking element and how we do the orchestration as opposed to the actual lower level scheduling portion of that. Much of that is well suited right now to be able to embrace. The other thing we need to do is wrap our heads around a variable trust architecture. We currently sit very much in either trusted boundary or untrusted boundary. And there's a nature of, as you begin to embrace more of these paths, there's a bit more granularity to how we leverage certain communication pipes or certain information sources that we need to begin to practice and understand. And so I think that's another thing we can't wait. There's already some great work going on at AFRL, as well as other places, and how do we work on these multi-path as well as multi-information source architectures. But that's something we can't wait until we figure the technical part out. It's very much need to be driven by the warfighter as the users of that information and the trust of that path. And once again, the processes that they already work on, such as the ATO process, already takes into the account ambiguity of information into a decision-making process. I think space needs to catch up in the thinking process because of the diversity of and the variable trust of information sources that are available today that have not been there in the past. Over.
Well, thanks for that. And I hope at the C2 summit coming up in about a week and a half, maybe some of that the discussion can be brought into the room there. Over.
Okay, we're quickly coming up on the end of time. Let me go to one of multiple questions that was sent in on the chat line. This is from Joe Vander Porten. Pardon my pronunciation there, Joe, but here's his question. Cross-link satellites offer intriguing possibilities to recast SATCOM. The underlying SATCOM enterprise, however, is fragmented across governance, industry, equipment standards, and user cultural communities. Did the Mitchell Group look at Space Force governance and enterprise management structures to unify concept pursuit to meet the China threat? I'm going to take that one on because it is a fascinating question and it's extraordinarily pertinent. And we didn't specifically in this particular report, but that is a topic that we will be reporting on in 2022. As a broad answer, yeah, the first step that could be taken is to follow some of the rationale for standing up the Space Force in the first place in terms of unifying the vast number of disparate organizations with a hand in space. But obviously there's a lot, much more that goes into that. But thanks very much for your question, Joe. That's something we're going to address in the future. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our Mitchell Institute Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence rollout of our policy paper, the backbone of JADC2, satellite communications for information age warfare. Many of you have already asked online, but it's available on the Mitchell Institute website right now. And we'll get this entire video and the slides up shortly. So to General Chilton, Lukas, Stephen, and David, many thanks for sharing your insights into these issues. And from all of us at the Mitchell Institute Spacepower Center of Excellence, have a great aerospace power kind of day.